This video is to illustrate how we can use a pressure reducing valve in a system to actually take system pressure, which is usually higher. In this case, we're going to be at 500 psi for our system pressure. And we're going to lower that pressure to a circuit to be somewhere around 300, or we can set it exactly where we want. It could be a lower number, it could be a higher number, but we can never make the pressure reducing valve read higher than what our system pressure is going to read, because all the oil will be going over our relief valve. I will illustrate how the pressure reducing valve works at this point. Number 2 on this valve is actually our inlet, and we put oil through. It's a normally open valve, which oil can pass through the valve, going in on the number 2 and coming out on number 1, going to our circuit. Notice on this valve that the pilot line sensing signal is on the outlet side. When pressure is to the set value that we want on side number 1, that valve is going to actually start to close off flow. Remembering from what we talked about earlier, if we can reduce flow, we can reduce pressure. Number 3 is also a line that we are going to use, and number 3 actually has to run back to tank. Number 2 is coming from our supply manifold, located on the lower left corner of our board. Coming out of the manifold, we're supplying that oil into position number 2 on our pressure reducing valve. Number 3 comes back out and it goes back to the return manifold on the lower left corner of the board. If we come back to our pressure reducing valve, we're going to see that number 1 is our outlet port, and that is going to go to the inlet or the P port on the control valve that you choose to use. One thing we will need to know about this valve: is it open center or is it closed center? If it's an open center valve, I will need to stroke the valve, extending the cylinder all the way out. While still holding the valve stroked, I will then read pressure. I will demonstrate this now. As you can see, I have very low pressure because we are using an open centered valve. So which means the oil is coming from our pump, flowing through the pressure reducing valve, going to our manual control valve, open center, and just flowing back to tank, because at this point in time, I am not moving the lever. As I move the lever, you will see the cylinder operate. As the cylinder went down, I am then going to hold my handle in an operated position, and then I'm going to go back and read the pressure on my valve. My system relief is set at 500 psi. The pressure reducing valve is also set at 500 psi at this time. I want to lower that pressure, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go to my pressure reducing valve and I'm going to make my adjustment on this valve here. If I lower the pressure, I'm going to screw that out, which is counterclockwise movement. If I want to raise that pressure, I'm going to screw it down, which is a clockwise movement. Well, because my system relief is set at 500 psi, my pressure reducing valve could not read any higher than what system relief valve is set to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out the screw on the pressure reducing valve to lower the pressure to the circuit that I have built. By turning the screw counterclockwise, that's going to lower our pressure, as it will indicate on the gauge. I went from 500 psi to 400 psi. We can go lower. Making another adjustment, going counterclockwise. Then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to check my system pressure. Now I only have 200 psi going to my circuit, but I have 500 psi supplying pressure to my pressure reducing valve. Therefore, we are limiting the oil flowing through the valve, which lowers our pressure on the outlet side. This is one circuit that you will build for your task sheets. Once you get this set, what you're going to want to do is then build a circuit coming off of the manifold and just running that line to a directional control valve on the P port. The first circuit we built will be at 300 psi. The second circuit that we built will be using the system relief valve, which is set at 500 psi.